What's up guys, hello to Footballtalk here, week 2 of this little mini-series as we switch conferences to question and hopefully to some degree at least answer the most glaring points of uncertainty for all 16 AFC teams. We already did so last week on the NFC side and there were some interesting topics that we dove into if you want to check it out afterwards. Again, since I moved from North to West in my most recent divisional draft and roster review series, we'll flip the order for this exercise as I bring up the most crucial questions for each of these teams projecting forward to the 2025 season. That can be based on a specific position or unit, how the depth chart is organized, certain schematic wrinkles, maybe how much responsibility is given to individual players, really whatever came to mind for me when I thought about the makeup and prospects of these franchises. I'm recording this about a week in advance by the way, just in case there's anything substantial that happens in the meantime that I don't reference here. Before we get into it however, let me just please ask you real quick that if you appreciate the time I've put into this video, you hit the like button and maybe subscribe if you haven't done so yet. Still have plenty of quality content planned for the off-season here and on my website hellotofootballtalk.com. The link is down below. Thanks for considering, and now let's get started in the AFC West, first up alphabetically with the Denver Broncos. And for them my question is, how much more trust does Sean Payton put into Bo Nix heading into year 2? I'm not sure if there was one singular move the Broncos made that truly blew me away, but as I look at the offseason in totality and go through the roster, it's tough to really poke any holes. Sean Payton spoke about wanting to add a joker, and we thought he was referring to a tight end or running back with the 20th overall pick in the draft, but instead he addressed those with veteran Evan Ingram and second round pick RJ Harvey out of UCF as this fun dynamo out of the backfield. I feel pretty damn confident in what this defense showed us last season and how I envision them taking the next step when it comes to creating problems for the best quarterbacks and offenses in the league, with the additions to the secondary especially, but truly all 3 levels of that unit, without any significant personnel losses, while keeping Vance Joseph around as the man pulling the strings. So my focus is shifting back towards the second-year quarterback Bo Nix, who had a really strong rookie season by the numbers, and I will classify him as a largely established commodity. Yet I'm wondering how much Sean is willing to put on his plate in his follow-up campaign. For as much as Bo exceeded the expectations of most, and Denver fans kinda turned on me at some point when I post my confidence ratings in first and second year guys at the position during the season, despite having him as the QB3 heading into that previous draft. If you actually look at the construction of this offense and what was asked of the guy under center, he became more effective as head coach and play caller, simplified the decision-making process for him. They minimized the amount of pure progressions and relied heavily on single read decisions, deploying designs that would open up the middle of the field for him to just rip throws into once he got to the top of his drop, and they became one of the most play-action heavy attacks. As opponents, especially in their own division, study those tendencies and force him to be a secondary reaction playmaker, can this duo take the next step together, diversify their approach, and ask the QB to make more advanced decisions post-snap? Next up, the Kansas City Chiefs. And for them I'm wondering, can this rookie class legitimately contribute straight away? Unlike the Broncos, who had to learn a hard truth when they were clearly outmatched by the Bills in the wildcard rounds and realized they needed to address a few areas on this roster to compete with the best in the conference, the sentiment around the Chiefs quickly changed once they got dominated physically in the Super Bowl loss to the Eagles. All of a sudden, when the magic had sort of worn off and we were able to take a sober look at these lineups for them, we as a football community started to question who's protecting Patrick Mahomes' blind sides. Is this group of pass catchers not strong enough collectively when facing a top 5 secondary? Can you attack their guys in coverage when the front can't cut down the time for quarterbacks in the pocket? And though Steve Spagnuolo isn't drawing up exotic looks as you get to third and long situations. And I wouldn't say that this operation felt the sort of urgency you'd anticipate coming off such a humbling loss, with the decisions early on in free agency, or even when you see them being willing to trade away All-Pro guard Joe Thuney. And with the way they can continue to restructure Mahomes' deal and put all the puzzle pieces around him on an annual basis, I don't really blame him for it. The door this opens up, however, is for the draft class, which I labeled one of the strongest across the NFL, to make a substantial impact from the jump. You can listen to my extensive breakdown of every single pick they made as part of my AFC West draft and roster review here on YouTube, but just on the surface, Josh Simmons was a number 2 offensive tackle based on the tape, and if he's fully recovered from the torn patella tendon, he could be a difference-making left tackle. Omar Norman-Lott was the most efficient interior pass rusher in the country, although on a limited snap total. Noel Williams is the exact physical corner profile that's back stability covered. Jalen Royals might immediately step in for a potentially suspended Rashee Rice as the designated yards after catch receiver, and that's not even it by any means. How much can they really rely on those guys? That brings us to the Las Vegas Raiders, and for them my question is, will the secondary hold back a franchise that clearly operates ahead of the supposed timeline? Since I just referenced that AFC West review video, something I expressed in the summary for the Raiders is my personal willingness to buy into what they're selling this offseason. When they finished last season with a 4-13 record, I don't think anyone considered them being in line for a quick turnaround to the degree of actually challenging for a playoff spot this season. And I'm not saying that I believe that'll be the case necessarily, but if you're willing to listen to the messages they're sending, that's probably how they see themselves. Just on the very base of this, you're not bringing in a 73-year-old Pete Carroll to slowly establish a culture and hope you become a contender in 3 or 4 years, even if you once kinda did that in Seattle. Then for him and new general manager John Spytek to trade for Pete's former quarterback Geno Smith, who I hold in much higher regard than the general public might due to the disastrous pockets he was dealing with last season in Seattle. And finally, to draft the running back in Ashton Genty 6th overall, who may be viewed as his new version of Marshawn Lynch, these guys aren't messing around. I would have liked to see them find more of a prototype X receiver to pair with what they already had in the building, and replacing Robert Spillane in the middle of the defense will be tough. But my real concern for them as it relates to them competing at the highest level this year is what they have behind that. Considering they also allowed one of the more reliable safeties in the league in Jerome Merrick to walk in free agency, this secondary is filled with reclamation projects and mid to late round picks. Jeremy Chin coming over from Washington may be the most well known piece, but he's a role player / hybrid defender who doesn't provide stability by himself. They are absolutely talented guys, and I think Patrick Graham is one of the more interesting defensive coordinators in the league, with the way he can mitigate some personnel deficiencies on the back end thanks to his diverse coverage portfolio, but this group is extremely volatile. While for the Los Angeles Chargers, I'm wondering, does this skill position group have enough for Justin Herbert to take the offense to the next level? They actually completely overhauled the front office and coaching staff last offseason when they brought over Joe Ortiz from Baltimore to be the new general manager and paired him up with John Harbaugh's brother Jim, coming off a national championship run, who brought along his defensive coordinator Jesse Minter, while linking up with old friend of the family Greg Roman to run the offense. Although you can certainly question if they did enough this offseason to help make this group take the next step, he did an outstanding job of maximizing the talent he had to work with in his first season, installing principles that allow these guys to play fast and with confidence. The offense remained a problem child, however. Initially the idea was to bring in Roman to orchestrate a downhill anti-run game, which has been his biggest strength at the NFL level, and take pressure off quarterback Justin Herbert that way. Unfortunately, they never quite found the consistency they were searching for, finishing tied for the 5th lowest rushing success rate as a team, and ultimately a lot was put in the man in the center to be a problem solver. Added to that, the interior part of the protection was even worse than previously. Again, they only made one real addition on the O-line, but Mekhi Becton replacing Trey Pipkins at right guard gives that group a much different feel, especially when it comes to the run game. So my focus shifts to this group of skill position guys, and pass catchers in particular. I called the backfield the most improved across the league this offseason, between Najee Harris and also first round pick Myron Hampton, yet bringing back Mike Williams off easily his least productive season with the Jets and Steelers since he was a rookie, with that extensive injury history, as the only veteran wide receiver addition doesn't inspire a whole lot of confidence, for as well as he and Herbert have worked together in the past. Outside of throwing in tight end Tyler Conklin, the ceiling of this aerial attack will be determined by how much more effective they'll be off play action, if they're able to expand the fairly limited and bland menu of passing concepts, and what the immediate returns from the trio of rookies in Trey Harris, Keandre Lambert-Smith, and the Ronald Gadsden looks like. Let's head down south now with the Houston Texans, and the question for them with me is, can Nick Haley solve some of the protection issues and provide my easy answers on a weekly basis? Since I just mentioned the Chargers backfield in the discussion, I covered the Texans' new receiving corps in detail last week already as part of my most improved position groups this offseason. You can read up on that over at helloswithfootballtalk.com, by the way. So even though 2 of the top 4 names might be those 2 rookies from Iowa State, they do have a true alpha number 1 receiver in Nico Collins, and I can very much see the rest of the crew come together in a cohesive way. In Houston's case, I'm much more concerned with certain schematic details on how they fix some of the red-blinking alarm lights that came up as I continued to watch the offense and the former coordinator Bobby Slowick. He had a lot of success in 2023, running basically a prototype version of the old Kyle Shanahan style offense from a few years ago, with CJ Stroud having a standard rookie season to enhance it. Yet as opponents sold out for them being stagnant, without any conceptual advancements, the down-and-down consistency suffered, and then because they constantly found themselves in third and long situations, not only were there leaky protections, thanks to a combination of bad planning and individual mishaps, but the young quarterback didn't nearly look as comfortable in the process, as pressure was coming in whilst having to diagnose more complex looks. So it was a cumulative effect of those factors, and never was that clearer than in the divisional round, when Spags was just toying with Sloak's highly questionable ways. He tried to counter all the different rush packages. Stroud did make plenty of key plays with his legs actually, but was pushed into creation mode all day. That's why it'll be pivotal what Nick Keeley can add to the mix. He has an interesting background, working on the Sean McVay in LA previously, but he has also spent an extensive period in New England before that as an assistant and got to work closely with all-time mastermind Dante Scarnecchia. I believe installing a system with clear defined rules, putting the protection responsibility on his quarterback, and implementing quick answers for when they do get overloaded will be atop the priority list for him. And I'd expect more of a vertical orientation of the run game, which they recently added veteran Nick Chubb to. For the Indianapolis Colts, nothing real new here, but will Anthony Richardson find a level of consistency needed to make the franchise believe in him again? At this time last year, I asked if Richardson has enough live reps to turn to a superstar potentially in his second season. We feel far away from that point right now, and the angst among this fanbase is palpable. There are some moving pieces on defense with a couple of new stars in the secondary, but that side of the ball is much more about how veteran defensive corner Lou Anarumo is coming in and adding more diversity to what they do coverage-wise especially. Offensively, they're trying to replace a pair of starters on the interior line with young players they already had in-house and have collected some experience, while first-round pick Tyler Warren will be a fun addition with the lineman flexibility and violent run-off-the-catch profile that he presents. But this is year 3 for Shane Steichen, potentially going into week 1 with Richardson as the designated starter, and he's somehow finished with a perfectly neutral 17-17 record, making some of the fill-ins on the center look more than decent. Of course, the added former Giant Daniel Jones in free agency, who was more similar in terms of skill set to AR. This appears to be a full-blown competition, which at the time in putting together these notes, Richardson, based on the reporting from a few days ago, actually isn't able to participate in due to banging up that shoulder he injured as a rookie. Personally, I was very willing to buy into the flashes he showed over his first month as a pro, and even though he clearly took a step back in his sophomore campaign in totality, once he returned to the lineup in week 11, I do believe he showed things to get excited about, even if the completion percentage may never look great. The talent as a two-way threat is undeniable, and even though the leadership change with the sudden death of owner Jim Irsay throws another wrench into this, I think if anything keeps this regime around, it's growth shown by the former number 4 overall pick. Tweaking his mechanics to a certain degree to find more consistent accuracy, and protecting himself to stay on the field are non-negotiables however, and based on some reporting around the franchise, he also has to step up his work habits. Which leads us to the Jacksonville Jaguars, and the question here is, how do they maximize the talent of a unicorn playmaker like Travis Hunter? I had 2 questions written down here originally, the other one being, can Liam Cohen help Trevor Lawrence bounce back, and in connection with that, how much does it diversify the run game? Because I still believe in him as a franchise quarterback, who I even made a video about last offseason, assessing if he was worth that 5-year, $275 million contract. My biggest takeaway from doing a deep dive on his 2 previous seasons was the lack of offensive designs that really put defenses in conflict, and the poor attention to detail overall. And with how Cohen had blown me away during his 1 year as the OC in Tampa to push forward that unit, I'm very excited to see a more buttoned-up operation. Having said all of that, I thought it'd be more fun to talk about the player this new regime has clearly centered the future around. The biggest shock of this most recent draft class came right after the very first selection, when Jacksonville pulled off a blockbuster trade to move up 3 spots from 5th overall of Cleveland, giving up the first round next year as part of this process to acquire the reigning Heisman Trophy winner Travis Hunter. As a 2-way star at Colorado, he dealt with a workload that was completely unprecedented for the college level, and he said all throughout the lead up to the draft that he intends on maintaining that. I certainly have reservations about him being a full-time contributor for both units, but it's a unique situation in how they navigate this. Based on my understanding, the primary focus will be on playing wide receiver, where he and last year's standout first rounder Brian Thomas Jr. could be a more than formidable duo, and he can focus on refining his route running, since he did most of his damage with his incredible ball skills to win down the field or his suddenness after the catch. But then how do you incorporate him as a package play on defense, where we don't really have any familiarity with new coordinator Anthony Campanile, and how much his coverages will be structured around rules, where you see route combinations 100 different ways in practice to be flawless in your distribution of responsibilities. And what does Travis's day-to-day schedule look like? That is fascinating to me. Closing out the AFC South now are the Tennessee Titans, and for them the question is this infrastructure around Cam Ward strong enough for him to thrive right away? Considering we just discussed the second overall pick, why don't we talk some about the player that the Titans actually kicked the draft off with when they called Cam Ward's name? And I don't think I can actually remember a quarterback in that spot who was less discussed leading up to or in the aftermath of the draft these last 2 decades. I have a scouting report on Cam at helloswithfootballtalk.com, and I discussed him going to Tennessee, my ultimate mock draft here on YouTube. And this was covered to a certain degree when I got to them in my divisional draft and roster review series. Let's talk a little bit about his supporting cast. Head coach Brian Callahan put his foot in his mouth a couple of times last season, especially when criticizing his then starting quarterback Will Levis. But although I wouldn't call anything they did offensive design-wise innovative, I thought the construction and sequencing of plays was sound. Looking back at what he did with Joe Burrow in Cincinnati, he'd love to use quick game, which Watt is very accustomed to doing and excels at as well, with his rapid release and deployment of different arm angles, also on RPOs. The offensive line definitely was a subpar unit last season, and I didn't agree with the money they spent on former Steel offensive tackle Demo Jr., but being able to get fairly stable play on the left side at least, and flipping J.C. Latham, the first-round pick from last year, back over to the right, where he was an All-American at Alabama, they're probably upgrading both spots, which is also absolutely the case with adding veteran Kevin Zeitler at right guard. If they can provide the running backs a little more space, I think they can have plenty of success on the ground. The most volatile ingredient should be the receiving corps. They paired up Kevin Ridley with Tyler Lockett, who could take some of the vertical stretching responsibilities away from the former, and Jefferson can be a solid number 3 in blocker. But then it'll be a trio of rookies that I'll be very interested in: Alec Iomena, Chimere Dike, and even UDFA Xavier Restrepo, who did a lot of damage in concert with Cam at Miami. Heading east now, beginning with the Buffalo Bills, and for them I'm wondering, can this defense get off the field on 3rd downs with the additions to the front and back end? The general manager Brandon Beane made some headlines this offseason when he went on a local radio show and told the hosts they were bitching around about them not adding more receiving talent, citing that Josh Allen and company scored 31 points per game last season, and how the priority was to improve the defense. Looking at the investments they made on that side of the ball, especially in the draft, they followed that blueprint, as the first 5 selections they made came on that side of the ball. Even though it was finally time that they move on from Von Miller, coming off an injury-riddled stint in Western New York, they handed Joey Bosa a 1-year incentive-laden prove-it deal, and they also brought back 2 former starting corners in Trey White and Dane Jackson on less than $5 million combined, after both had lackluster years elsewhere. What's curious about this approach is that it's yet again a high-quantity influx of talent, even though the big deal with them and the ceiling of this perennially well-coached and constructed unit has always been defined by the need of true difference makers. That's why a fresh Bosa, if they can largely limit him to being an ace in passing downs, and to some degree the first round of Maxwell Harrison at corner coming in, with the guy's elite speed and click and close ability to make more plays on the football. First and foremost, however, as the basis of most of the additions, they need to limit explosive run plays. They were near the top of the league in run stuff rate, thanks to the front, but the angles and tackling of the safety group last year was rough, which they hope Cole Bishop can step up in a more prominent second-year role as a former second-rounder, along with maybe one of the rookies. That contributed to them finishing tied for 28th with Arizona in terms of 3rd down percentage allowed at 43.8%. In those situations, they want to be able to throw waves at opponents and have that internal competition for who can actually get home as a heavy cage rush unit. Next up, the Miami Dolphins, and I'm wondering, do we feel a different level of physicality from this team with reinforcements in the trenches? The Fins are sort of an odd team this offseason, because you barely seem to hear anyone talk about them in detail, outside of speculations about a couple of guys who might not be there much longer, with trade discussions around wide receiver Tyreek Hill and cornerback Jalen Ramsey. In terms of veteran transactions that have already taken place, they saw left tackle Tron Armstead retire, while James Downing is a guard, and a couple of safeties in the Fates Miller-Fanwu and Ashton Davis are the only additions most likely stepping into prominent roles. This often high-flying offense certainly took a slight step back last season, with Tua Tagovailoa again missing 6 games, but the defense under new leadership with Anthony Weaver finished top 10 in basically all meaningful metrics, and in 3 years under Mike McDaniel, they are 28-23 as a team, and that includes a 3-7 record without Tua. So even though some of the shine of this has come off, they've been a very competitive squad when they just had the quarterback available. What clouds that view, however, is that they've repeatedly fallen off towards the end of seasons, in parts because of they were playing in inclement weather conditions, but also just facing the best competition, where they've continuously been outmatched physically. Opponents being more prepared for such a perimeter-oriented run game, and the defensive front being vulnerable to being pushed off the ball, to some degree due to injuries to be fair, have continued to show up as issues. That's why I thought they sent a clear message when the draft rolled around, as they selected Michigan tackle Kenneth Grant in the first, and actually traded up for Arizona tackle/guard Jonas Avainia in the second round, along with a hard-hitting box-oriented safety, another nose tackle, and a 225-pound running back later on day 3. I'm not saying that a 6th rounder will make a massive impact, but adding him, and to a lesser degree maybe veteran Alexander Madison, does indicate that they may be looking to hit more runs between the tackles, especially with the question marks they have out there. And with all that beef on the D-line now, to mitigate negative box counts and get to always passing downs, Weaver's exotic pressure packages may be even more prominent. Let's see if those things can actually materialize. Leading us to the New England Patriots, and I'm wondering, how does the rest of the offense come together to support a second-year jump by Drake May? I just highlighted them completely overhauling the defensive front as part of my article on most improved position groups around the league, and I'm interested in seeing how different they look like under Mike Vrabel and defensive coordinator Terrell Williams. Yet I also referenced how they potentially upgraded their skill position group in substantial ways, especially through the draft once again. The combination of Ohio State running back Trevion Henderson and Washington State wide receiver Kyle Williams on day 2 should provide a much different level of explosiveness for a unit that was desperately lacking those qualities. That was after raising the baseline with veteran Stephon Diggs, at least as long as he's finally off that boat and committed to being reliable on the field, with all the different option routes and slot usage in that offense, and Mac Hollins as a strong blocker and occasional vertical ball winner type. Although we can question the long-term viability of 4th overall pick Will Campbell out of left tackle, since I label him a future interior player, he and long-term stalwart Morgan Moses should be massive floor raisers on the edges of this whole line, and they at least have a couple of solid options to take over at center, after they struggled to plug the hole left behind by David Andrews once he got hurt and ultimately retired. The most pivotal figure in bringing everything together, however, and helping Drake May ascend to a true franchise quarterback level, is a familiar face in New England, Josh McDaniels. Say what you want about him as a leader or head coach, but the man has been on the forefront of offensive ingenuity and play calling for a long time. Alex Van Pelt's name, as they will see last year, garnered some respect around the league, and he was working with very limited pieces, but the way McDaniels can provide answers for his quarterback in a multifaceted system that isn't as rigid, and how he's able to continuously poke at weak spots in the defense is on a different level. I see a path for Drake, if he can handle the language in the system, with the flashes he showed as a rookie, to really jump onto the scene league-wide. Lastly, in the East, the New York Jets, and for them the question is, will this be a stingy team built on the run game and defense and this new regime? Let's not sugarcoat this. The Jets have been a mess for the better part of the last 15 years, after those surprising back-to-back AFC Championship appearances under Rex Ryan, only finishing with a record above 500 once since 2010. You can blame the lack of leadership at the top, confusing decisions of when to keep around or part ways with people in prominent positions, or the never-ending search for a savior of the franchise at quarterback. This past season was sort of a microcosm of that. Owner Woody Johnson receiving an F grade from his players in that annual NFLPA survey, in part because his sons supposedly are in meetings, citing pattern ratings to actually make personnel decisions, suddenly firing head coach Robert Saleh following a 2-3 start to the year, and later also GM Joe Douglas, the defense falling off with Jeff Ulbrich taking on the interim job and having less time for the day-to-day operation, along with collectively feeling less invested and getting pushed around a lot. Rodgers and his OC Nick Hackett never truly getting the offense off the ground to take flight, as they say. There was just so much stuff that fell off. That's why this new operation, hoping ownership at least allows them to set the tone, could offer such a stark contrast. Aaron Glenn bringing over Tanner Engstrand as the Lions' former passing coordinator offensively, veteran DC Steve Wilkes, and to some degree even the man in charge of special teams Chris Banjo, and no-nonsense coaches. Even the personnel decisions they largely made revolved around reinforcing the trenches and adding hard-nosed leaders on the field. I don't see a ceiling that people receive with Rodgers at the helm these last couple of years, but could they be an annoying team to face with how they've put together this O-line, pounding the rock, and tapping back into what the Stephens have been for the better part of this previous regime with a new voice at the top now. Somewhat in the mold of what Aaron Glenn was part of in those early days in Detroit. Which brings us to a final division of the day, the AFC North, first up with the Baltimore Ravens. The question here, can Zach Orr build on a success defensively for the second half of last season? It's kind of funny to look at the parallels between the 2022 and 24 Ravens defenses, just like Mike McDonald's first year in Baltimore, when they became a totally different unit once they traded for Roquan Smith, and things around him started to click. We saw the unit make a pretty massive turnaround over the second half of last season, with Zach Gordon calling the shots. They went from 26th in EP per play over the first 8 weeks to second in that metric behind only the eventual Super Bowl champion Eagles from that point onwards. This time around, the play call also honed in on some of the things they excelled at and became more aggressive in key situations, but even more so this was about how to deploy the personnel. Swapping out a couple of veteran safeties for Darius Washington and the ace Kyle Hamilton moving back from the big nickel role with Marlon Humphrey sliding inside led to way fewer coverage busts and guys scrambling in general. Unfortunately, Washington tore his Achilles early this offseason and will miss all of 2025, but other than allowing the biggest weak link at corner in Brandon Stevens to walk in free agency, that unit pretty much remains fully intact, and they had previously addressed safety with what I had ranked a top 10 player in the draft in Georgia's Malachi Starks at the end of round 1. Overall, they added rookies at basically every single position, with 6 names total, including the one I had right below Starks in Marshall Edge Mike Green, who only fell to the second round due to character concerns, which I'm not going to discuss in this capacity. Evaluating his tape alone, he has a chance to become the best pass rusher outside since Terrell Suggs probably. How will that influx of talent factor in right away? Does the presence of the first rounder free up Hamilton again to be more of a movable piece wreaking havoc around the line of scrimmage? Can Roquan bounce back after a little bit of a down season? And is Orr not comfortable enough to tap into more creative looks in defined dropback settings? Meanwhile, although they've had success at times during the Joe Burrow era, even helping them reach a Super Bowl, this summer feels more like the beginning stages for a different phase for this Bengals defense, and my question for those Cincinnati Bengals is, how many of the issues across this defense can Al Golden fix? Last year I asked how Cincy might cut down some of the explosive plays they had allowed in 2023. Instead of doing that, they actually took a massive step backwards in terms of the down-to-down consistency, while the big plays for opponents remained. Trey Hendrickson was the only bright spot among that unit, leading the league with 17.5 sacks, his second time hitting that total in as many years. In the aftermath of the continued regression, they decided to fire veteran defensive coordinator Lou Anarumo, who can certainly be viewed as a scapegoat for much larger issues, but clearly change was needed. They replaced him with Al Golden, who previously had a lot of success at Notre Dame, as his units allowed less than 16 points per game in each of the past 2 seasons, which was top 10 nationwide in both. Last year in particular, the swarming style to create turnovers and the tight man coverage they ran helped boost them to a run at a national championship game. Asking him to work wonders and take a unit that just finished in the bottom quartile in basically every meaningful metric defensively to anything above average would be foolish. But what are the main issues that he's going to be trying to tackle? Early in the year especially, they struggled to stop the run, with the front getting moved off the landmarks. They added a true space eater and nose tackle TJ Slayton from the Packers, but otherwise need some of the young guys to step up around it. How much more aggressive will they be with the linebackers, where a couple of rookies could factor in with the recent release of Jermaine Pratt, as he put faith in the still pretty young secondary to lock up in a lot of isolated coverage potentially. Their first round pick Shamar Stewart hasn't even signed his rookie deal and started to practice due to quibbling around some little detail in the contract structure, and even though they desperately need someone else to get to the passer, and he's more of a developmental guy in the passers department anyway, the offense could absolutely light up the scoreboard, but this group needs to show more resistance to opponents. Now for the Cleveland Browns, I'm wondering what's the plan for this quarterback room and how much does it matter for 2026? Which I understand isn't much of a novel concept for this franchise overall, and what the talking points are this offseason specifically, whenever the Browns do come up. Week 1 left the defense is capable of reaching the heights that they showed a couple of years ago under Jim Schwartz, with the additions to the front 7, but this is simply what matters most. Just to run through the key events one more time, Deshaun Watson tore his Achilles midway through last season, and supposedly tore it again a few months later. The owner Jimmy Haslam literally called the completely misguided trade and fully guaranteed contract they handed to him a swing and a miss. Then they traded Dorian Thompson-Robinson plus a 5th round pick for Kenny Pickett, brought back 40-year-old Joe Flacco on a 1-year deal, before drafting Oregon Dylan Gabriel in round 3, and then a couple of rounds later, stopping the unprecedented slide of Colorado's Shedeur Sanders after they were at different points mocked to pick him 2nd overall. Obviously, this has become a crowded room, and I said after the draft that Pickett might be the odd man out here, because Flacco was the comeback player of the year for them in 2022, and the lad of the rookies, if he puts his head down to work, has starting level trades for as overrated as he was by a bunch of people early in the process, I thought. You'd think Kevin Stefanski is safe with the success he's had despite that rotating cast of signal callers, but does he just want to put Flacco out there to be competitive, or is he open to maximizing the window to evaluate these rookies? I think we'll see a shift back from his amalgamation experiment, where they needed to put Deshaun in the shotgun, and someone tried to merge that with the more horizontal run game towards what he's had success with at different points with other guys on the center, more condensed sets and play action offense. I think this oddly suits basically all of the guys in different ways, but how much of a priority is winning this year? And what would one of the youngsters have to show them to not use that extra first round pick next year to get aggressive in what's perceived to be a much stronger quarterback class? Team number 32 now in the series, the Pittsburgh Steelers, and for them the final question here is, will Arthur Smith's run game provide this offense a steadier baseline? It would have been very easy to just jump on the two prominent storylines around Pittsburgh since last season ended, on the heels of yet another highly disappointing playoff exit, where the arrow continued to point downwards for both sides of the ball, with Russell Wilson turning into a pumpkin and the defense getting run over by Baltimore, where this all leads with Mike Tomlin as the man in charge came up again. Him never finishing with a losing record has been stated a million times, but they've also not won a postseason game since 2016. The even bigger underlying topic has been Aaron Rodgers' delayed arrival in Western Pennsylvania, internally debating if he was going to try and make another run in the new place, how his working relationship with Tomlin, and even more so the OC Arthur Smith will look like, is an interesting piece of this, which we may only know in case things go wrong. But considering they were willing to wait that long, with Mason Rudolph as the only veteran on the roster, along with drafting Ohio State's Will Howard in the 6th round, should tell us that they're committed to making it work some way or another. For as much as we can criticize how Rodgers handled himself in New York, and how stuck in his ways he was with running a somewhat antiquated offense, I don't believe they ever were as successful on the ground as they would hope for. And this is a guy who's typically very happy to check into run calls if he sees favorable looks for it. That's where Smith comes in, who other than when they finished 20th in rushing success rate as a team last year, orchestrated two of the better rushing attacks in the league with Tennessee and then Atlanta. Based on selecting Iowa's Caleb Johnson in round 3 and the burst of Jalen Warren to capture the edge, I'd expect them to lean into a lot more wide zone again. They should be healthy up front and added a couple of strong blocking receivers on the perimeter. What that entails, however, is more of a bootleg/pocket movement approach offense, and that's where Rodgers' comfort physically and playstyle wise come into play again. That brings us to the end of the second half of this little mini series, going through the key questions for every single team in the league. Thank you so much for watching. Whether it's your first time here or you've been subscribed for a long time, please click the thumbs up button and maybe also the little bell to know whenever I upload anything here. The video on the NFC will pop up in the top right corner shortly if you're also interested in that. Additionally, you can go back and check out my divisional draft and roster review series, which I've referenced a few times here. That's a total of just over 6 hours, giving all 32 teams their time to shine, and I added timestamps for each of them. I'll be back next week, starting another 2-piece project on second and third breakout candidates at hellofootballtalk.com in written form. Hope to have you back for that, and feel free to look into all my other content over there. The link is down below in the video description. So until then, see you later. Peace!